This is Mrs. Wainwright's Math Class, Chapter 1, Lesson 1B, reading numbers less than 1 and place value. Today's learning targets: I can correctly read decimal numbers through the 10,000ths, and I can name place value columns through the 10,000ths. Since we're talking about decimal numbers or numbers that are less than 1, let's take a look at some numbers that are less than 1 first. A number that represents an amount less than 1 is shown as either a decimal number or as a fraction. Let's take a look at some Hershey bars to really understand this. Here is one whole Hershey bar. I have the whole thing, so I'll shade it in to show that I have the whole Hershey bar. How do I write that Hershey bar as a digit? I write the digit 1 because that's one whole Hershey bar. How do I write that as a word? O-N-E, 1. So that represents one whole Hershey bar. Let's take a look at another Hershey bar. Here's my Hershey bar, but I'm going to take this Hershey bar and I'm going to break it into 10 little pieces. My Hershey bar is now broken into 10 little pieces. I don't have all of those pieces. I only have one of those little pieces, so I'll shade in one of those pieces. How much Hershey bar do I have in this picture? I have 1/10 of a Hershey bar. That's the fraction form. Why is it 1/10? Because I have one piece out of the 10 pieces it takes to make a whole Hershey bar. I could also write that as a decimal form, which is 0.1. That's the decimal form. Why do I have a 0 there? Because I have 0 whole Hershey bars in this picture. We're looking at just this specific picture, and I simply have 1/10. The decimal shows me that everything to the right of it is less than a whole, so I only have one little piece of those tenths. How do I write either the fraction or the decimal as a word, or how do I say it? The proper way to say it is 1/10. Notice that it's not 1/10 because that would be 10 whole Hershey bars. It's 1/10, and the TH at the end shows us that it is less than 1. That's what the TH stands for. So let's take a look at another Hershey bar. Here we go. This Hershey bar I'm going to break into 100 little pieces. So this Hershey bar is broken into 100 little pieces. But I don't have all of those pieces. For this last Hershey bar, I have only one of those tiny, tiny little pieces. It's really kind of only enough to just barely taste the chocolate when it melts on your tongue. What would that look like as a fraction? That would look like 1, because I have one piece, over 100, because it takes 100 pieces to make a whole Hershey bar. This is the fraction for this picture. How would that look as a decimal? It would be 0.01. Notice that looks different than the one to the left of it, which is 0.1. This is 0.01. That's the decimal. And that stands for the word, or how you would read it, is 1/100th. Let's focus in on these zeros, though. Why do I have this first 0 before the decimal? Well, that's the ones column, and I don't, in this last picture, I do not have one whole Hershey bar. I have 0 whole Hershey bars in this last picture, so I put the 0. Why do I put a 0 to the right of the decimal in the tenths column? Because I have 0.10 of a Hershey bar. I have 0 sticks. I don't have any entire stick. I only have one tiny little piece, so I have to put a 0. Why do I put the 1 on the right-hand side? Because I have one tiny little 100th, or 1/100th of the Hershey bar. That's how we would read it, and that's how we write it, 1/100th. And again, notice that TH tells me that that 1/100th is not 100 Hershey bars. Boy, that would be a lot of Hershey bars. That's only 1/100th. One tiny little piece where it takes 100 pieces to make the whole Hershey bar. So that's certainly very little chocolate. Let's take a look at this next example. This shows me how much chocolate I have. My chocolate is all shaded in. So I have to figure out how much chocolate do I have here. And now I count my pictures, I see 5 Hershey bars. So is my answer 5? Do I have 5 whole Hershey bars? Well, no. I don't have 5 whole Hershey bars. Why not? Because one of that last Hershey bar is not a full Hershey bar. So although I see 5 rectangles or 5 bars, I do not have all of them because that last bar is not full. So no, 5 would not be a correct answer. Okay, let's take another guess. Well, I see 4 whole Hershey bars, so why don't I write 4? And then I see 1 little tenth, so why don't I write the 1 to show that there's 1/10 there? Is that how much chocolate I have? Well, if I go back and look at it, I know that number is 41. Do you see 41 whole Hershey bars there? I certainly don't. So no, it cannot be 41. What am I going to do? How am I going to show how much chocolate I have with digits? Well, I know that I have 4 whole Hershey bars, so I'll write down my 4. I also know that that last Hershey bar, I have less than 1. I only have a little bit of it. And I know when I have less than 1, I have to show that to the right of the decimal. So I put my decimal next to the 4. Now, that Hershey bar that is not whole is divided into 10 pieces. How many of pieces do I have? I have 1 of those pieces. So 4.1. Is that how much chocolate I have? Yes, I have 4 1/10 of a Hershey bar. So this picture shows 4 1/10 Hershey bars here. That's represented as 4.1. Now the question is, how do I read this? Do I say 4.1? Do I say 4.1? What's the correct way to read this number? Okay, let's check it out. So what do we call this 5 right here? Well, we use the information to the left of the decimal to help us. Remember, in the ones column, the 1 in the decimal, or the 1 in the end, there's only 1 1. So if I'm going to move to the left in this direction, after the ones column, there's only 1 1, which column comes next? That's right, it's the tens column. Well, this isn't 10. This 5 doesn't stand for 5 tens because it's not 50. It stands for 5/10, 5 small parts that it takes to make a whole. So this would be, instead of tens, as we see in this column, the name will be tenths with the THS at the end. So that 5 is in the tenths column. Remember, there's only 1 1. The next is 10, so on this side, the next is tenths with the THS. So now to the right of the 5, I've added a 9. Again, this number is to the right of the decimal, it's to the right of the ones, so it's less than a whole. What column will this be? Well, we have tenths, because we had tens. The next column here is 100, so what do you think this will be? Hundredths with the THS at the end. Notice it follows the same pattern. Okay, now I've added an 8. What do you think the name of this column will be? Again, it follows the same pattern. I had 10, so tenths, 100, so hundredths. What is the name of the column that the 8 is in? Well, I have 1,000, so this will be the thousandths. And finally, for our last decimal column, I've added a 6 right here. What do you think the name of this column will be? Well, again, we had tens, tenths, 100, hundredths, 1,000, thousandths. So the 6 will be, sorry, I'm having a hard time with this arrow, 10,000. So this column will be that's right, 10 thousandths. So as a recap, there's only 1 1, and the decimal comes next to it. Then it goes in the exact same order but backwards. This column is 10 tenths, 100 hundredths, 1,000 thousandths, 10,000 10 thousandths. If I put another digit, what do you think it would be? Well, this is 100,000, so the next digit would be 100,000ths, and so on and so forth. So if I look back down at my word and my periods right down here, I have, and I look at my ones, next to the ones I would have in that word form, I would have my decimal. And to the right of that, what would be the name of the period? Well, actually, it's pretty simple. This would be called the decimal period. So now we have our full place value chart exactly as you'll need to know. And again, when studying this place value chart, if you make sure that you memorize this whole section right here, which is your ones, tens, hundredths, then you memorize the names of your periods, which are the ones, thousands, millions, and billions. You can help yourself just by those things. You can figure out the names of all of the columns. So let's go back and focus ourselves back in on our standard form number. This number is 4 with a decimal and a 1. How do I read that number? Well, remember, for my whole numbers, I read period by period. There's only one digit in this number in the whole numbers column. When I look at that digit by itself, that is the number 4. So I would write the word 4. 4. There's no comma, but there is a decimal. And I know that decimal's name is and. So I write and, which shows me that that's a decimal. And finally, I'm going to focus in on the digits to the right of the decimal. In this case, it's simply a 1. We would say that as 1. But if I read that 4 and 1, that doesn't make sense. I don't have 4 and 1 Hershey bar. If I look back at the picture, I don't have 4 and 1 Hershey bar because that would be 5. And we said that 5 is not the number of Hershey bars that I have. I have 4 and 1/10 of a Hershey bar. So how do we know that we say tenths? Well, this digit right down here, once again, this digit right here is the first digit to the right of the decimal. And I look at the first digit in my place value chart to the right of my decimal. I see the name of that place value is tenths. So that tells me what to write for my name. This is 4 and 1/10. I won't put the S at the end since 1 is a singular number. But if it was 4 and 2/10, I would put the S at the end. Any number other than 1, I would put the S. That's not that big of a deal, but this is how I read this number, 4 and 1/10. Remember, the way we read it is the word form as well. So let's go back and look at this place value chart that we made, this full place value chart that goes from 1 to 100 billions in whole numbers, and on the decimal side goes all the way down to 10 thousandths. If I want to focus in and look on this number that we wrote right here on top, here's my question. How do we read this whole big number? Well, this will be our example number 1. And we're going to read it the way we learned the whole number, the way we learned in lesson 1A. And our decimal portion, we'll just keep going right on through the way we learned the decimal portion in this lesson. We're going to write it in word form because remember, word form is exactly how we read the number. First thing I like to do when I'm going to read a number or write the word form is I always find my ones column. If there's a decimal, I know where the ones column is because the ones column is just before the decimal. If there is no decimal, I know my ones column is the very last digit. So I highlight my ones column because I know that there's only 1 1. Next thing I'm going to do is label my periods. I know this is the ones period because it has the ones column in it. After the ones period comes the thousands, millions, billions. I know that this is the decimals period. I'm going to turn my paper sideways, and after the ones comes the tenths, hundredths, thousandths, I'll do the TH for the thousandths, and 10 thousandths. Okay, everything's labeled. Now it's pretty easy for me to go ahead and start reading my number. Remember, I start at the left and read period by period. 742 is the number 742. So we'll write that down. 742, comma tells me to say the name of the period, which is billion. Put my comma. Now I'm going to move to the next period. 987 is 987, so I'll write that down. And 987 is in the millions column, so I'll write the name million. Put my comma to remind myself that I'm going to the next period. My next period is 654, which I would read as 654. I'll write that. I'm at the comma, which tells me to say the name of the period, and that is thousand. Write the name of the period, put my comma. I'm at the next number, which is 321. I read that 321, so I will write that. There is no comma, but there is a decimal, and I know that the decimal's name is and, so I will write that. And finally, I'm going to move over into my decimal column, 5986, and if I was reading that number, how would I read that number? I would read that number as 5,986. So I write it as I read it. 5,986. And I have to say the last digit, that 6. What column is it in? I have the TH, which is 10 thousandths, and I simply write down the name of that column, 10 thousandths. So when I end with a decimal, my last words are always the name of that specific column that the last digit is in. So let's take a look at this number. The correct way to read it and the correct word form we said is 742,987,654,321 and 5,986 10 thousandths. Please stop and do worksheet number 1. Again, you can go back to this problem, go through it slowly, stop as you go to help you with worksheet problem number 1. This is example number 2. You should have finished worksheet number 1 before you watch this example. If you have not yet done so, please stop the recording and complete worksheet number 1. So example number 2, the directions say read then write in word form. Once again, first thing I want to do is find my ones column. When there's a decimal, I know that my ones column is just before my decimal. I like to highlight my ones column and my decimal to remind myself that there's only one 1. Now I like to remind myself for the names of my periods. This is the ones period, thousands, millions. In the decimal section, after there's only one 1, so this would be the tens, hundreds, and TH for thousands. I start on the left side and work period by period. This is the only digit in this first period before my comma, and that is the number 5. So I write down 5. My comma tells me to say the name of the period, which is M for million. 5 million, comma. Move to the next period. 270 is 270. I write that down. Comma tells me to say the name of the period, which is 1,000. So I'll write that down. And of course, put my comma. I move to the next period, which is 493. I read that as 493. There's no comma, but there is a decimal, and I know that my decimal's name is and. So I write that down. And finally, I move to my last column, which is my decimals column. I read the number exactly as I see it, 271, write it down, and I end reading and writing my decimal number with the name of the final column. That one is in the thousandths column, so I'll write thousandths with my THS. Therefore, this final number is 5,270,493 and 271 thousandths. Now it's time to stop and do worksheet number 2. Again, you can look back at this example number 2 in the video as often as you like. We're up to example number 3. Please make sure you have completed worksheet number 1 and worksheet number 2 before starting this example. Okay, so example number 3 is set up a little bit different. It says shade this amount, then write it in word form. And the amount that I have is 3.2. It gives me my boxes, which is nice. They're all set up, and I have to shade this amount. So I'm going to look at my whole number first, which is 3. That means I need to shade in 3 whole Hershey bars. I'll do that right now. But actually, I'm realizing it's probably a good idea to label my columns in my decimal column. So to the right of the ones place in the decimal is the tenths column, and then I have the hundredths column. So I'm going to shade my whole number, which is the 3. That's 1 whole Hershey bar, 2 whole Hershey bars, 3 whole Hershey bars. So I have now shaded 3 whole Hershey bars. I move to my next column, which is my tenths column. Remember, a tenth is a whole Hershey bar divided into 10 sections, and each digit counts for the number of sticks in that section. So I have 2 tenths. How am I going to shade that in? I'll shade in 1 tenth, 2 tenths. That's it. I'm not going to touch the other bars. I move to my final column, my 4, which is in the hundredths column. I know that the hundredths column means it's 1 out of 100 pieces that it takes to make a whole. I have 4 of those hundredths, so I'll need to shade in 4 hundredths. 1, 2, 3, 4. This picture now shows 3 whole Hershey bars and 24 hundredths, which is 2 tenths and 4 hundredths. How do I write this number? 3. Decimal's name is and. My decimal number, I read the whole thing, 24. And I say the last place value column of the last digit. That 4 is in the hundredths column, so that will be hundredths. So this number is 3 and 24 hundredths. Please stop right now and do worksheet number 3. Again, you can come back and look at this problem as often as you like. So a recap on this lesson: if you know your place value columns, you can read numbers. Remember, if there's a decimal, the number right before the decimal is the ones column. There's only one 1. We then we have our whole numbers, our periods, ones, thousands, millions, billions. For our decimal periods, instead of 10, we have tenths. Instead of 100, we have hundredths. Instead of 1,000, we have thousandths, and instead of 10,000, we have 10 thousandths. Those are our columns for our place value chart. And finally, we learned when reading the number, we focus in on our periods, ones, thousands, millions, billions, our decimals with their names, tenths, hundredths, thousandths, 10 thousandths, and we go ahead and read from left to right, period by period. 742 billion, 987 million, 654,321, and 5,986 10 thousandths.